Hello and welcome to the NVR podcast, season 2, episode 3. I'm Rachael Aylmer.
And I'm Peter Jakob.
And today we're talking about overcoming parental trauma. Go on, Peter. I'm going to say the same thing. How do we get here?
It follows on from our last podcast where we spoke about parental trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very inspired by the distinction that you made between parent-centered work in NVR, or NVR being parent-centered, and child-focused work in NVR, and that it can be both and. That we can be parent-centered and child-focused. And if we are parent-centered, we take the person of the parent seriously.
Yeah.
And we take the effects on the person of the parent of, past violence, and then re-traumatization perhaps by their child's violence. Seriously. Just like we take the effects on the person of the parent seriously that come from critical and, prescriptive communication from communities outside of the family, professional communities, larger family system, friends, neighbors who are critical towards parents. We take all that seriously and we work with that. So I think if we are parent-centered and child-focused, we can pay attention to the needs of the child, but we also have the needs of the parent and the need to overcome certain difficulties at the forefront of our minds, of our practice. So I guess that's how we got there.
Yeah, it is. And I recall last year delivering some training when I quoted that, and a participant said, "But the parents are the perpetrators."
Oh gosh.
who was clearly thinking about the work as child centered, and that parents, there's almost parents were non-existent, which when we think about, Haim's his keynote at the NVR conference around parent blaming, all just fit in so well with that attitude of this practitioner fearing that the parents were to blame for the child's trauma, and it felt very one-sided. But yeah, well, that's another story. But yeah.
So it sounds to me what you're saying is that actually in NVR, we bring the parent into existence. We legitimize the parent's distress. But then in helping parents overcome trauma, I guess we go one step further. We legitimize distress. We legitimize the parent expressing distress, feeling distress, allowing themselves to acknowledge that they feel distress. And then we look at helping to overcome distress. But it seems to me that maybe that legitimizing of distress is the first step towards change, that legitimizing the distress, because your course participant was delegitimizing parental distress, apart from being very harmful, of casting parents in a position of perpetrator.
Yeah, really harmful. Very, very, narrow-minded.
Well, and I guess a parent who faces a professional who sees them as the reason for the child's violence, and who's ultimately victim blaming, will have the effect on the parent that the parent doesn't, or many parents that they don't feel that their own distress is legitimate, worth paying attention to. So I guess just putting the parent's distress on the table, and I think we made a start with that in the last podcast. I think that's the first step to change for the parent, is the first step towards overcoming some of that distress.
Just the fact that parents have a safe place to talk about their struggles, their suffering, and that there's space created for them to reflect on those conversations in the weeks between the days between each of the NVR sessions we have. Parents often come back and say, you know, that discussion we had last week was really profound. I've never told anybody how difficult it is to manage at home life and how hard it is. And I think that's really a safe place to create.
Well, and in order to be able to change something, I have to be able to name it, to find that it's acknowledged, to find that I'm taken seriously with it. I'm thinking of so many, you know, we say parents. And indeed, many fathers, many foster dads, and so forth, many male caregivers, struggle, as do mothers, as do female caregivers. Yet, what I've heard so many mothers say to me, or adoptive mothers, or foster carers, is how they particularly suffer from misogyny. Whether the child who tends to attack them is a boy or a girl. They suffer from misogynistic language. And they start out feeling almost bad about naming it, and sort of saying things like, well, you know, it's sort of like, but maybe I shouldn't say this, but it sort of feels like domestic abuse. And I think that shows an inner struggle to find words, you know, and to legitimize one's own feeling and experience. Am I even allowed to put it that way? Am I not doing wrong? Yet, this is how it feels to me.
I've also witnessed parents very capable of naming that, but then also experience a lot of shame that it's their child that they're talking about. You know, it's within their family. So the parent can find the words to name that abuse, but then just that shame that's how did it get here? How did we get here?
Well, and maybe that encompasses another aspect of self-blame of parents and of blaming processes of parents. But I'm just thinking of the effect of the naming and the permission to name. And I'm wondering, is this something that we need to look at in very, very close detail in our work with parents? That permission giving, our giving the parents permission to name what happens to them, how it feels, how they experience it, that is actually a really important part of the therapeutic process in NVR, a very important part of how, not necessarily just the child, but how the parent starts to change.
Yeah.
What I wonder, what experience have you had that comes to mind of a parent or parents sort of when they've felt that they've named it and you have accepted their naming it? How do they react?
I think that's what you've just been describing about the change. I think that's when the biggest change comes about, when there's a voice and a feeling behind that expression. And that's when the resistance can start to kick in. I feel that's when parents start the fight. And I don't mean fight as in a physical fight.
We don't want that.
No, but the shift, this is where it stops. Almost that Rosa Parks quote about the only tired I was the tired of giving in. And it's almost that shift of how a parent, through that voice, can then acknowledge that enough, I'm no longer giving in. I'm going to make a stand against this behaviour.
Gosh, I'm feeling that we're moving on rapidly in our conversation right now. And I wonder whether that mirrors how sometimes things can move on very rapidly for parents inside of themselves in the NVR process. And I just want to go back to a turn of phrase that you used. You spoke about the voice behind the expression.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering whether you could say more about that.
I think parents sit with these behaviours silently, and then they connect with the practitioner, and trust is built, and respect and space, and then communication and curiosity bring about healthy discussions. And maybe for the first time, a parent can voice what's happening to him or her in their home with their child, be it a looked after child, adopted child, however, their child. And then that voice behind that, that emotion that maybe a parent has carried these feelings for a long time, and then voice it. We all know how that can speak volumes by naming something. It's almost when you've named it, change now has to come about. It's inevitable. I feel that by naming it, by putting it out there, by hearing your voice mention that suffering or that struggle, is now the next step. Now is action.
And because I think what struck me when I heard you use that turn of phrase was the memory of a first session with a client, a mother whose son was violent towards her, who had experienced domestic violence from his father, who had experienced emotional abuse during her childhood, and who in the session literally could not speak. So that voicelessness was both a emotional, psychological voicelessness, and literally, she was literally voiceless. And for her to find her voice in the NVR process became part of her therapy towards overcoming trauma.
Yeah.
Because I guess having your voice is perhaps the first step, or one of the first steps, towards self-determination. Rather than being determined or feeling that you're going through life being determined by others in your life. And you just spoke about Rosa Parks, who said that the only time she was tired, or only time she was tired, was the fatigue, or that sets in from giving in.
Well, the only tired she was tired of giving in. That was the only tired she was.
Oh, did she mean, I'm just tired of giving in? Or did she mean giving in is what has made me feel tired? Or did she mean both?
Both. I think, what were you tired of? She was just tired of giving in. That was her expression.
perhaps we should mention for those listeners who may not be familiar with the historic figure of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an American civil rights activist who triggered what became known as the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott when she refused to get up to make space for a white passenger on the segregated bus system of Montgomery, Alabama, and triggered a huge struggle during the civil rights movement. And she was a lifelong civil rights activist, just to inform people who may not be familiar with her. So, because what strikes me from her quote, and there might be some ambiguity in that, is that perhaps if you're tired of giving in, and giving in makes you tired, then engaging in what we call constructive fighting, what Aylmer has called constructive fighting, perhaps that can be energizing. Even if it's effortful, even if it costs energy in the moment and in the planning, ultimately it can give you energy. Because I think you feel activated, you feel alive, you feel engaged with the world when you're in touch with your own determination. Starting with having your voice.
Yeah. It energizes you. Yeah, definitely.
And I guess, I keep coming back to your use of that turn of phrase, of the voice behind the expression. Having your voice in the therapy session or consultation with the NVR practitioner can be a start to finding, using your voice with your child, whether it's, in the announcement that we practice in a sit-in. I guess there's a difference, and I wonder how to express that. There's a difference between just, reading the announcement and really having that voice, that real expression, which comes across, which is embodied. And I'm just wondering whether we can talk about that difference a little bit. That difference between, right, I'm doing NVR, I've read out an announcement to my daughter or whatever, and there being a really embodied response in which the parent really gives voice to their expression.
I've witnessed this so many times that after the announcement delivery, the energy from the parent is noticeably different. There's conviction, there's commitment, there's a different stance in the parents, there's empowerment, there's a strength, maybe a strength that the parent hadn't connected with for a long time or noticed in self.
Right.
So I think that taking action, is the real shift. It's about the change that's starting to take place.
Maybe there's one difference between I'm taking action or I'm doing what the NVR practitioner told me I should do. Yeah. So if I'm, to use a comparison in athletics, if I'm skiing or running or whatever my sport is in such a way, simply because the coach told me to, then it's not really me. If, however, I'm using my coach, but I'm aware that this is me who's doing it and I need to do it in my way, albeit, using the information that the coach offers me, then I will be successful. Or I'm more likely to be successful. And you've mentioned all those inner processes that can emanate from taking such action. Commitment, empowerment, strength, conviction. I mean, these are really important aspects. And something I was thinking about in terms of parents overcoming trauma is, okay, we see the dyad between parent and child. We see how certain behaviors of the child may mirror something the parent has experienced and re-traumatize the parent. What is also there are things that impact on the parent or may impact on the parent from other quarters. So I'm thinking of critical and prescriptive, as I call it, communication, people blaming parents, criticizing parents, even if it's well-intentioned, what you need to do, what your kid needs to do, he needs to go to boot camp, which implicitly blames the parent because it says you're too weak or you're not able to do it, and so forth and so on. We may have, particularly in families that are dealing with multiple stressors, we may have sort of high levels of aggression in the neighborhood. We may have a previous partner of the parent who continues to exert harmful influence on the family. We may even go further, and we may think of the parent blaming effects of racist attitudes that communicate themselves in a myriad ways. I'm a Black single mom of a Black boy, and I'm seen differently in society, which ultimately one could see as a traumatizing, response. Traumatizing response to the parent. So there's so many dimensions or channels, I think, where trauma happens. And I'm just thinking of how these qualities that you've mentioned, conviction, commitment, empowerment, strength, may also encourage parents to resist in those areas should they feel the need to. And how we as the NVR practitioner are not just operating within the framework of new authority within the parent-child dyad, but we can help resist in those different dimensions.
That was a lot of words.
Oh, sorry, I've been talking too much.
No, not at all, but I'm just absorbing everything that you're saying. Give me an example of that.
Well, I'm just thinking of someone who was sexually abused in her childhood, who experiences a lot of anxiety, and whose son's physical aggression, particularly towards his sister, seems to bring back or raise or elevate some of that her anxiety. So we see the need that she resists. She sees the need to resist what he's doing to his sister, and she loves both children. But the abuse that she suffered as a child, it's not really over. The person who abused her at the time has never acknowledged the abuse. Indeed, that person has gone on to abuse, it appears. So actually, the sexual abuse, as far as she's concerned, is not over. It's not finished. And she tells me that her mother keeps contacting her and her mother feels guilty, but her mother is somehow looking to her to absolve her from that guilt or from those feelings of guilt. And she said that brings it back as well.
Of course it would.
So we're just starting to look at, okay, well, how can you resist what your mother's doing? I mean, her mother is not perpetrating any kind of violence against her, yet there's something that her mother is doing that is re-traumatizing. There is something, well, there's a lot that the person who sexually abused her in her childhood did and is still doing. That person's denial of sexual abuse, that person is still doing that. That is traumatizing. And we have the boy's violence against his sister. That is re-traumatizing. So I'm looking with her at resistance in those areas as she sees fit and as she feels is necessary. And that's where I think NVR can go way beyond new authority in helping parents overcome trauma.
Yeah, we often talk in our trainings that you know, that I think in the field of children and family work, you know, NVR works for violent kids. You know, how people can just narrow it down. And so quite often we're having to really remind early stages of training practitioners that NVR supports families with a heap of things, not just about focusing on a violent child, but a harmful behaviour, and how it supports parents overcome trauma.
Well, and indeed, Chaim Omer says NVR is therapy for parents. But parents are people. So maybe NVR is therapy for the person of the parent, not just for the parent as a parent, for the parent's parenting.
Yeah. I like that.
I just thought, because you brought up Rosa Parks, and I just thought maybe I could bring up Frederick Douglass, who was an American abolitionist who had grown up in slavery, who escaped slavery, and in his memoir wrote that at a certain point in his life, due to his resistance against what the slavers were doing to him, that he could be a slave in form only, but no longer in fact. And what he meant was that the courage and the pride and the self-determination that he later felt was gained by virtue of standing against the oppression that he experienced, and that he found courage. And that, to me, ties in with what Rosa Parks said, that when you know what needs to be done, fear diminishes. And I think the diminishing fear is actually about resolving trauma.
Which I'm sure we could talk for another 30 minutes about.
Well, should we do a podcast on diminishing fear?
It could be number 4, couldn't it?
It could be.
I'll make a note of that.
Should we leave the listeners on that cliffhanger?
Shall we? I think it's hard to summarize today's podcast. There's been a lot. We've covered a lot and only little snippets. For me, I'm wondering whether the listeners would be kind of going, yeah, but you haven't quite defined how we support parents overcoming trauma, or how we can help parents do that. it's difficult for me to summarize, but I think what I'm sensing is talking starts the change by exploring what is going on for a parent as a person, and having those spaces to communicate and put a voice to that emotion can begin that process of resistance and change.
Yeah.
For me, that's kind of what I got from that. I probably barked up the wrong tree.
No. I don't think it was the purpose of today's podcast to outline the methods that we use in NVR to help facilitate that. I think it was more about, deepening our own, your and my, and the listener's understanding of the principle underlying that reduction in trauma.
That's good.
Okay.
Well, Peter, you're off for a month soon, and we're going to perhaps think about that topic when you return.
Yeah.
But it will be coming.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be in the wilds of northern Arizona if all goes well.
Okay. I hope it all goes well. Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, thank you. And it's goodbye.
Bye.